Chapter 27. Let the high muse chant love's Olympian. We are but mortals, and must sing of man. An eminent philosopher among my friends, who can dignify even your ugly furniture by lifting it into the serene light of science, has shown me this pregnant little fact. Your pier glass, or extensive surface of polished steel made to be rubbed by a housemaid, will be minutely and multitudinously scratched in all directions. But place now against it a lighted candle as a center of illumination, and lo, the scratches will seem to arrange themselves in a fine series of concentric circles round that little sun. It is demonstrable that the scratches are going everywhere impartially, and it is only your candle which produces the flattering illusion of a concentric arrangement, its light falling with an exclusive optical selection. These things are a parable. The scratches are events, and the candle is the egoism of any person now absent, of Miss Vincy, for example. Rosamond had a providence of her own, who had kindly made her more charming than other girls, and who seemed to have arranged Fred's illness and Mr. Wrench's mistake in order to bring her and Lydgate within effective proximity. It would have been to contravene these arrangements if Rosamond had consented to go away to Stone Court or elsewhere, as her parents wished her to do, especially since Mr. Lydgate thought the precaution needless. Therefore, while Miss Morgan and the children were sent away to a farmhouse the morning after Fred's illness had declared itself, Rosamond refused to leave Papa and Mamma. Poor Mamma, indeed, was an object to touch any creature born of woman, and Mr. Vincy, who doted on his wife, was more alarmed on her account than on Fred's. But for his insistence, she would have taken no rest. Her brightness was all but dimmed. Unconscious of her costume, which had always been so fresh and gay, she was like a sick bird with languid eye and plumage ruffled, her senses dulled to the sights and sounds that used to most interest her. Fred's delirium, in which he seemed to be wandering out of her reach, tore her heart. After her first outburst against Mr. Wrench, she went about very quietly. Her one low cry was to Lydgate. She would follow him out of the room and put her hand on his arm, moaning out, "Save my boy." Once she pleaded, "He has always been good to me, Mr. Lydgate. He never had a hard word for his mother," as if poor Fred's suffering were an accusation against him. All the deepest fibres of the mother's memory were stirred, and the young man, whose voice took a gentler tone when he spoke to her, was one with the babe whom she had loved, with a love new to her, before he was born. "I have good hope, Mrs. Vincy," Lydgate would say. "Come down with me and let us talk about the food." In that way he led her to the parlour where Rosamond was, and made a change for her, surprising her to taking some tea or broth that had been prepared for her. There was a constant understanding between him and Rosamond on these matters. He almost always saw her before going to the sick-room, and she appealed to him as to what she could do for Mamma. Her presence of mind and adroitness in carrying out his hints were admirable, and it is not wonderful that the idea of seeing Rosamond began to mingle itself with his interest in the case, especially when the critical stage was past, and he began to feel confident of Fred's recovery. In the more doubtful time, he had advised calling in Dr. Sprague, who, if he could, would rather have remained neutral on Lydgate's account. But after 2 consultations, the conduct of the case was left to Lydgate, and there was every reason to make him assiduous. Morning and evening he was at Mr. Vincey's, and gradually the visits became cheerful, as Fred became simply feeble, and lay not only in need of the utmost petting, but conscious of it, so that Mrs. Vincey felt as if, after all, the illness had made a festival for her tenderness. Both father and mother held it an added reason for good spirits when old Mr. Featherstone sent messages by Lydgate, saying that Fred must make haste and get well, as he, Peter Featherstone, could not do without him, and missed his visit sadly. The old man himself was getting bedridden. Mrs. Vincey told these messages to Fred when he could listen, and he turned towards her his delicate, pinched face, from which all the thick blonde hair had been cut away, and in which the eyes seemed to have got larger, yearning for some word about Mary, wondering what she felt about his illness. No word passed his lips, but to hear with eyes belongs to love's rare wit, and the mother, in the fullness of her heart, not only divined Fred's longing, but felt ready for any sacrifice in order to satisfy him. "If I can only see my boy strong again," she said in her loving folly, "and who knows, perhaps master of Stone Court, and he can marry anybody he likes then." "Not if they won't have me, mother," said Fred. The illness had made him childish, and tears came as he spoke. "Oh, take a bit of jelly, my dear," said Mrs. Vincey, secretly incredulous of any such refusal. She never left Fred's side when her husband was not in the house, and thus Rosamond was in the unusual position of being much alone. Lydgate naturally never thought of staying long with her, yet it seemed that the brief, impersonal conversations they had together were creating that peculiar intimacy which consists in shyness. They were obliged to look at each other in speaking, and somehow the looking could not be carried through as the matter of course which it really was. Lydgate began to feel this sort of consciousness unpleasant, and one day looked down, or anywhere, like an ill-worked puppet. But this turned out badly. The next day Rosamond looked down, and the consequence was that when their eyes met again, both were more conscious than before. There was no help for this in science, and as Lydgate did not want to flirt, there seemed to be no help for it in folly. It was therefore a relief when neighbours no longer considered the house in quarantine, and when the chances of seeing Rosamond alone were very much reduced. But that intimacy of mutual embarrassment, in which each feels that the other is feeling something, having once existed, its effect is not to be done away with. Talk about the weather and other well-bred topics is apt to seem a hollow device, and behaviour can hardly become easy unless it frankly recognises a mutual fascination, which, of course, need not mean anything deep or serious. This was the way in which Rosamond and Lydgate slid gracefully into ease, and made their intercourse lively again. Visitors came and went as usual. There was once more music in the drawing-room, and all the extra hospitality of Mr. Vincey's mayoralty returned. Lydgate, whenever he could, took his seat by Rosamond's side, and lingered to hear her music, calling himself her captive, meaning all the while not to be her captive. The preposterousness of the notion that he could at once set up a satisfactory establishment as a married man was a sufficient guarantee against danger. This play at being a little in love was agreeable, and did not interfere with graver pursuits. Flirtation, after all, was not necessarily a singeing process. Rosamond, for her part, had never enjoyed the days so much in her life before. She was sure of being admired by someone worth captivating, and she did not distinguish flirtation from love, either in herself or in another. She seemed to be sailing with a fair wind just whither she would go, and her thoughts were much occupied with a handsome house in Lydgate, which she hoped would by and by be vacant. She was quite determined when she was married to rid herself adroitly of all the visitors who were not agreeable to her at her father's, and she imagined the drawing-room in her favourite house with various styles of furniture. Certainly her thoughts were much occupied with Lydgate himself. He seemed to her almost perfect. If he had known his notes, so that his enchantment under her music had been less like an emotional elephant's, and if he had been able to discriminate better the refinements of her taste in dress, she could hardly have mentioned a deficiency in him. How different he was from young Plymdale or Mr. Caius Larcher. Those young men had not a notion of French and could speak on no subject with striking knowledge, except perhaps the dyeing and carrying trades, which of course they were ashamed to mention. They were Middlemarch gentry, elated with their silver-headed whips and satin stocks, but embarrassed in their manners and timidly jocose. Even Fred was above them, having at least the accent and manner of a university man, whereas Lydgate was always listened to, bore himself with the careless politeness of conscious superiority, and seemed to have the right clothes on by a certain natural affinity, without ever having to think about them. Rosamond was proud when he entered the room, and when he approached her with a distinguishing smile, she had a delicious sense that she was the object of enviable homage. If Lydgate had been aware of all the pride he excited in that delicate bosom, he might have been just as well pleased as any other man, even the most densely ignorant of humoral pathology or fibrous tissue. He held it one of the prettiest attitudes of the feminine mind to adore a man's preeminence without too precise a knowledge of what it consisted in. But Rosamond was not one of those helpless girls who betray themselves unawares and whose behavior is awkwardly driven by their impulses instead of being steered by wary grace and propriety. Do you imagine that her rapid forecast and rumination concerning house furniture and society were ever discernible in her conversation, even with her mamma? On the contrary, she would have expressed the prettiest surprise and disapprobation if she had heard that another young lady had been detected in that immodest prematureness, indeed, would probably have disbelieved in its possibility. For Rosamond never showed any unbecoming knowledge and was always that combination of correct sentiments, music, dancing, drawing, elegant note-writing, private album for extracted verse, and perfect blonde loveliness, which made the irresistible woman for the doomed man of that date. Think no unfair evil of her prey. She had no wicked plots, nothing sordid or mercenary. In fact, she never thought of money except as something necessary which other people would always provide. She was not in the habit of devising falsehoods, and if her statements were no direct clue to fact, why, they were not intended in that light. They were among her elegant accomplishments, intended to please. Nature had inspired many arts in finishing Mrs. Lemon's favourite pupil, who, by general consent, Fred's excepted, was a rare compound of beauty, cleverness, and amiability. Lydgate found it more and more agreeable to be with her, and there was no constraint now. There was a delightful interchange of influence in their eyes. And what they said had that superfluity of meaning for them which is observable with some sense of flatness by a third person. Still, they had no interviews or asides from which a third person need have been excluded. In fact, they flirted, and Lydgate was secure in the belief that they did nothing else. If a man could not love and be wise, surely he could flirt and be wise at the same time. Really, the men in Middlemarch, except Mr. Fairbrother, were great bores, and Lydgate did not care about commercial politics or cards. What was he to do for relaxation? He was often invited to the Bulstrodes, but the girls there were hardly out of the schoolroom, and Mrs. Bulstrode's naive way of conciliating piety and worldliness, the nothingness of this life, and the desirability of cut glass, the consciousness at once of filthy rags and the best damask, was not a sufficient relief from the weight of her husband's invariable seriousness. The Vincey's house, with all its faults, was the pleasanter by contrast. Besides, it nourished Rosamond, sweet to look at as a half-opened blush rose, and adorned with accomplishments for the refined amusement of man. But he made some enemies, other than medical, by his success with Miss Vincey. One evening he came into the drawing-room rather late, when several other visitors were there. The card table had drawn off the elders, and Mr. Ned Plymdale, one of the good matches in Middlemarch, though not one of its leading minds, was in tête-à-tête with Rosamond. He had brought the last keepsake, the gorgeous watered silk publication which marked modern progress at that time, and he considered himself very fortunate that he could be the first to look over it with her, dwelling on the ladies and gentlemen with shiny copper-plate cheeks and copper-plate smiles, and pointing to comic verses as capital and sentimental stories as interesting. Rosamond was gracious, and Mr. Ned was satisfied that he had the very best thing in art and literature as a medium for paying addresses, the very thing to please a nice girl. He had also reasons, deep rather than ostensible, for being satisfied with his own appearance. To superficial observers, his chin had too vanishing an aspect, looking as if it were gradually being reabsorbed, and it did indeed cause him some difficulty about the fit of his satin stocks, for which chins were at that time useful. "I think the Honourable Mrs. S. is something like you," said Mr. Ned. He kept the book open at the bewitching portrait and looked at it rather languishingly. "Her back is very large. She seems to have sat for that," said Rosamond, not meaning any satire, but thinking how red young Plymdale's hands were, and wondering why Lydgate did not come. She went on with her tatting all the while. "I did not say she was as beautiful as you are," said Mr. Ned, venturing to look from the portrait to its rival. "I suspect you of being an adroit flatterer," said Rosamond, feeling sure that she should have to reject this young gentleman a second time. But now Lydgate came in. The book was closed before he reached Rosamond's corner, and as he took his seat with easy confidence on the other side of her, young Plymdale's jaw fell like a barometer towards the cheerless side of change.
Rosamond enjoyed not only Lydgate's presence, but its effect. She liked to excite jealousy. "What a late comer you are," she said as they shook hands. "Mamma had given you up a little while ago. How do you find Fred?" "As usual, going on well, but slowly. I want him to go away, to Stone Court, for example, but your mamma seems to have some objection." "Poor fellow," said Rosamond prettily. "You will see Fred so changed," she added, turning to the other suitor. We have looked to Mr. Lydgate as our guardian angel during this illness." Mr. Ned smiled nervously, while Lydgate, drawing the keepsake towards him and opening it, gave a short, scornful laugh and tossed up his chin as if in wonderment at human folly. "What are you laughing at so profanely?" said Rosamond with bland neutrality. Poor young Plymdale had lingered with admiration over this very engraving, and his spirit was stirred.
"There are a great many celebrated people writing in the keepsake at all events," he said, in a tone at once piqued and timid. "This is the first time I have heard it called silly." "I think I shall turn round on you and accuse you of being a Goth," said Rosamond, looking at Lydgate with a smile. She herself was not without relish for these writers, but she did not readily commit herself by admiration, and was alive to the slightest hint that anything was not, according to Lydgate, in the very highest taste. "But Sir Walter Scott, I suppose Mr. Lydgate knows him," said young Plymdale, a little cheered by this advantage. "Oh, I read no literature now," said Lydgate, shutting the book and pushing it away. "I used to know Scott's poems by heart." "I should like to know when you left off, because then I might be sure that I knew something which you did not know." "Mr. Lydgate would say that was not worth knowing," said Mr. Ned, purposely caustic. "On the contrary," said Lydgate, showing no smart, but smiling with exasperating confidence at Rosamond. Young Plymdale soon went to look at the whist-playing, thinking that Lydgate was one of the most conceited, unpleasant fellows it had ever been his ill fortune to meet. "How rash you are," said Rosamond, inwardly delighted. "Do you see that you have given offence? What, is it Mr. Plymdale's book? I'm sorry, I didn't think about it."
"I shall begin to admit what you said of yourself when you first came here, that you are a bear and want teaching by the birds. Well, there is a bird who can teach me what she will. Don't I listen to her willingly?" To Rosamond it seemed as if she and Lydgate were as good as engaged. That they were sometime to be engaged had long been an idea in her mind, and ideas, we know, tend to a more solid kind of existence, the necessary materials being at hand. It is true, Lydgate had the counter-idea of remaining unengaged, but this was a mere negative, a shadow cast by other resolves, which themselves were capable of shrinking. Circumstance was almost sure to be on the side of Rosamond's idea, which had a shaping activity and looked through watchful blue eyes, whereas Lydgate's lay blind and unconcerned as a jellyfish which gets melted without knowing it. That evening, when he went home, he looked at his files to see how a process of maceration was going on with undisturbed interest, and he wrote out his daily notes with as much precision as usual. The reveries from which it was difficult for him to detach himself were ideal constructions of something else than Rosamond's virtues, and the primitive tissue was still his fair unknown. Moreover, he was beginning to feel some zest for the growing, though half-suppressed feud between him and the other medical men, which was likely to become more manifest now that Bulstrode's method of managing the new hospital was about to be declared. And there were various inspiriting signs that his non-acceptance by some of Peacock's patients might be counterbalanced by the impression he had produced in other quarters. Only a few days later,
when he had happened to overtake Rosamond on the Lowick road, and had got down from his horse to walk by her side until he had quite protected her from a passing drove, he had been stopped by a servant on horseback with a message calling him in to a house of some importance, where Peacock had never attended. And it was the second instance of this kind. The servant was Sir James Chetham's, and the house was Lowick Manor. Chapter 28. First Gent. All times are good to seek your wedded home, bringing a mutual delight. Second Gent. Why, true, the calendar hath not an evil day, for souls made one by love, and even death were sweetness if it came like rolling waves, while they two clasped each other and foresaw no life apart. Mr. and Mrs. Carsabon, returning from their wedding journey, arrived at Lowick Manor in the middle of January. A light snow was falling as they descended at the door, and in the morning,
when Dorothea passed from her dressing-room into the blue-green boudoir that we know of, she saw the long avenue of limes lifting their trunks from a white earth and spreading white branches against the dun and motionless sky. The distant flat shrank in uniform whiteness and low-hanging uniformity of cloud. The very furniture in the room seemed to have shrunk since she saw it before. The stag in the tapestry looked more like a ghost in his ghostly blue-green world. The volumes of polite literature in the bookcase looked more like immovable imitations of books. The bright fire of dry oak boughs burning on the logs seemed an incongruous renewal of life and glow, like the figure of Dorothea herself as she entered carrying the red leather cases containing the cameos for Celia. She was glowing from her morning toilet as only healthful youth can glow. There was gem-like brightness on her coiled hair and in her hazel eyes. There was warm red life in her lips. Her throat had a breathing whiteness above the differing white of the fur, which itself seemed to wind about her neck and cling down her blue-grey pelisse with a tenderness gathered from her own, a sentient, commingled innocence which kept its loveliness against the crystalline purity of the outdoor snow. As she laid the cameo cases on the table in the bow window, she unconsciously kept her hands on them, immediately absorbed in looking out on the still, white enclosure which made her visible world.
Mr. Carsabon, who had risen early complaining of palpitation, was in the library giving audience to his curate, Mr. Tucker. By and by, Celia would come in her quality of bridesmaid as well as sister, and through the next weeks there would be wedding visits received and given, all in continuance of that transitional life understood to correspond with the excitement of bridal felicity, and keeping up the sense of busy ineffectiveness as of a dream which the dreamer begins to suspect. The duties of her married life, contemplated as so great beforehand, seemed to be shrinking with the furniture and the white vapour-walled landscape. The clear heights where she expected to walk in full communion had become difficult to see even in her imagination. The delicious repose of the soul on a complete superior had been shaken into uneasy effort and alarmed with dim presentiment. When would the days begin of that active wifely devotion which was to strengthen her husband's life and exalt her own? never perhaps as she had preconceived them, but somehow, still somehow, in this solemnly pledged union of her life, duty would present itself in some new form of inspiration and give a new meaning to wifely love. Meanwhile, there was the snow and the low arch of dun vapour. There was the stifling oppression of that gentle woman's world, where everything was done for her and none asked for her aid, where the sense of connection with a manifold, pregnant existence had to be kept up painfully as an inward vision, instead of coming from without in claims that would have shaped her energies. What shall I do?
Whatever you please, my dear. That had been her brief history since she had left off learning morning lessons and practicing silly rhythms on the hated piano. Marriage, which was to bring guidance into worthy and imperative occupation, had not yet freed her from the gentlewoman's oppressive liberty. It had not even filled her leisure with the ruminant joy of unchecked tenderness. Her blooming, full-pulsed youth stood there in a moral imprisonment which made itself one with the chill, colourless, narrowed landscape, with the shrunken furniture, the never-read books, and the ghostly stag in a pale, fantastic world that seemed to be vanishing from the daylight. In the first minutes when Dorothea looked out, she felt nothing but the dreary oppression. Then came a keen remembrance, and turning away from the window, she walked round the room. The ideas and hopes which were living in her mind when she first saw this room nearly 3 months ago were present now only as memories. She judged them as we judge transient and departed things. All existence seemed to beat with a lower pulse than her own, and her religious faith was a solitary cry, the struggle out of a nightmare in which every object was withering and shrinking away from her. Each remembered thing in the room was disenchanted, was deadened as an unlit transparency, till her wandering gaze came to the group of miniatures, and there, at last, she saw something which had gathered new breath and meaning. It was the miniature of Mr. Casaubon's Aunt Julia, who had made the unfortunate marriage of Will Ladislaw's grandmother.
Dorothea could fancy that it was alive now, the delicate woman's face, which yet had a headstrong look, a peculiarity difficult to interpret. Was it only her friends who thought her marriage unfortunate, or did she herself find it out to be a mistake, and taste the salt bitterness of her tears in the merciful silence of the night? What breaths of experience Dorothea seemed to have passed over since she first looked at this miniature. She felt a new companionship with it, as if it had an ear for her and could see how she was looking at it. Here was a woman who had known some difficulty about marriage. Nay, the colours deepened, the lips and chin seemed to get larger, the hair and eyes seemed to be sending out light. The face was masculine and beamed on her with that full gaze which tells her on who it falls that she is too interesting for the slightest movement of her eyelid to pass unnoticed and uninterpreted. The vivid presentation came like a pleasant glow to Dorothea. She felt herself smiling, and turning from the miniature, sat down and looked up as if she were again talking to a figure in front of her. But the smile disappeared as she went on meditating, and at last she said aloud, "Oh, it was cruel to speak so. How sad, how dreadful." She rose quickly and went out of the room, hurrying along the corridor with the irresistible impulse to go and see her husband and inquire if she could do anything for him. Perhaps Mr. Tucker was gone, and Mr. Casaubon was alone in the library. She felt as if all her morning's gloom would vanish if she could see her husband glad because of her presence.
But when she reached the head of the dark oak, there was Celia coming up, and below was Mr. Brooke, exchanging welcomes and congratulations with Mr. Casaubon. "Dodo," said Celia in her quiet staccato, then kissed her sister, whose arms encircled her, and said no more. I think they both cried a little in a furtive manner, while Dorothea ran downstairs to greet her uncle. "I need not ask how you are, my dear," said Mr. Brooke, after kissing her forehead. "Rome has agreed to you, I see. Happiness, frescoes, the antique, that sort of thing. Well, it's very pleasant to have you back again, and you understand all about art now, eh? But Casaubon is a little pale, I tell him, a little pale, you know. Studying hard in his holidays is carrying it rather too far. I overdid it at one time." Mr. Brooke still held Dorothea's hand, but had turned his face to Mr. Casaubon. "About topography, ruins, temples. I thought I had a clue, but I saw it would carry me too far, and nothing might come of it. You may go any length in that sort of thing, and nothing may come of it, you know." Dorothea's eyes also were turned up to her husband's face with some anxiety at the idea that those who saw him afresh after absence might be aware of signs which she had not noticed. "Nothing to alarm you, my dear," said Mr. Brooke, observing her expression. "A little English beef and mutton will soon make a difference. It was all very well to look pale, sitting for the portrait of Aquinas, you know. We got your letter just in time. But Aquinas, now, he was a little too subtle, wasn't he? Does anybody read Aquinas?"
He is indeed not an author adapted to superficial minds, said Mr. Casaubon, meeting these timely questions with a dignified patience. "You would like coffee in your own room, uncle?" said Dorothea, coming to the rescue. "Yes, and you must go to Celia. She has great news to tell you, you know. I leave it all to her." The blue-green boudoir looked much more cheerful when Celia was seated there in a pelisse exactly like her sister's, surveying the cameos with a placid satisfaction, while the conversation passed on to other topics. "Do you think it nice to go to Rome on a wedding journey?" said Celia, with her ready, delicate blush, which Dorothea was used to on the smallest occasions. "It would not suit all, not you, dear, for example," said Dorothea quietly. "No one would ever know what she thought of a wedding journey to Rome." "Celia, has something happened?" said Dorothea, in a tone full of sisterly feeling. "Have you really any great news to tell me?" "It was because you went away, Dodo. Then there was nobody but me for Sir James to talk to," said Celia, with a certain roguishness in her eyes. "I understand. It is as I used to hope and believe," said Dorothea, taking her sister's face between her hands and looking at her half anxiously. "Celia's marriage seemed more serious than it used to do." "It was only 3 days ago," said Celia, "and Lady Chetham is very kind." "And you are very happy?" "Yes. We are not going to be married yet, because everything is to be got ready, and I don't want to be married so very soon, because I think it is nice to be engaged, and we shall be married all our lives after." "I do believe you could not marry better, Kitty. Sir James is a good, honourable man," said Dorothea warmly. "He has gone on with the cottages, Dodo. He will tell you about them when he comes. Shall you be glad to see him?" "Of course I shall. How can you ask me? Only I was afraid you would be getting so learned," said Celia, regarding Mr. Casaubon's learning as a kind of damp which might in due time saturate a neighbouring body.